I mentioned in the channel trailer that I get annoyed by both the left and the right, so this seemed like a perfect first topic to take on, because both sides of this issue are about as batshit crazy as you can get. I'm going to start with the right wing, because their lunacy is quicker to point out than the depths of doublethink that we must wade through on the left. Conservatives, if you are going to insist that all Muslims are dangerous, then you need to admit that you are afraid of people like Kareem Abdul-Jabbar and Cat Stevens. Next, you need to quit calling anyone else cowardly or weak, because it doesn't get any more cowardly than that. Most westernized Muslims are about as likely to kill you for being an infidel as you are to kill someone for working on Sunday. When you paint a broad brushstroke, not only do you fail to address the actual problem, but you actively harm the cause. Many Muslims are pushing for the type of reforms that would reduce terror attacks. If you truly care about stopping such attacks, then those Muslims are not the enemy, they are an ally. The right and the left also have a strange habit of exposing hypocrisy while at the same time committing it. I see memes like this one shared by my conservative friends a lot, along with a similar sentiment to the one expressed at the bottom of this one. Yes, the meme does display a level of hypocrisy that the left is guilty of a shocking amount of the time across a wide variety of issues. But to recognize that hypocrisy and then engage in it yourself just makes you look stupid, and engaging in said hypocrisy while simultaneously accusing someone else of it is exponentially more hypocritical. It's like hypocrisy squared. Christian conservatives also need to rein in their hypocrisy regarding freedom of religion. They'll scream about it from the rooftops, but their definition of religious freedom often means forcing other people to pray to their God in school, or yelling oppression when a business chooses to include everyone in a holiday greeting instead of just them. They'll correctly point out the problems with Sharia law, then bitch and moan when their own religious edicts aren't allowed into our legal system. When discussing the problems with the spread of radical Islam, it is important for such conservatives to separate out the actual problems from their blatant disdain for any religion other than their own. That doesn't mean that there are no double standards on the left regarding Christianity, particularly as it relates to Islam. We can see one of them from this segment of a Buzzfeed video. So, Buzzfeed thinks you are a bigot if you have a problem with someone embracing all of the doctrines associated with Islam. Let's take a look at a couple of passages from the Hadith. But first, let's take a look at what the Hadith is. It is the second most important text in Islam, next to the Quran. Although not regarded as the spoken word of God like the Quran, the Hadith is an important source of doctrine, law, and practice. So commands in the Hadith are a doctrine associated with Islam. They might not all be core doctrines, they might not be followed by all Muslims, but that isn't what the quote said. It said all doctrines associated with Islam. And since it said all doctrines, Buzzfeed thinks you are a bigot for disagreeing with any of them. I picked a fun one that lets us play a little game at the end. Here it is. If a man who is not married is seized committing sodomy, he will be stoned to death. So, Buzzfeed thinks you are a bigot if you have a problem with people stoning someone for sodomy. And before anyone claims that those lines were taken out of context and aren't doctrines of Islam, tell it first to the gay men in the 5 Islamic countries where homosexuality is punishable by death, or the countless others where it is illegal. Let's set up the little game I talked about, though. We'll start by looking one verse back from where we were to see exactly where the idea that stoning people for sodomy came from. The Prophet said, "If you find anyone doing as Lot's people did, kill the one who does it and the one to whom it is done." So it comes from the Torah, the Old Testament, story of Lot, Sodom and Gomorrah. So here's our little game. If we take the 4 main religions associated with the Old Testament, Judaism, Christianity, Islam, and Mormonism, guess how many would get defended by Buzzfeed for holding those views? If you guess just one, you win the game. Would Buzzfeed call you a bigot for objecting to someone holding this nearly identical view from the Old Testament? If a man lies with a male as with a woman, both of them have committed an abomination. They shall surely be put to death. Their blood is upon them. Leviticus 20:13. I think we all know the answer to that question. Of course the person holding those views would be called the bigot, and people criticizing them would be seen as tolerant, and rightly so. I'm not in any way disputing that that verse is horribly bigoted, but how is it any different from the Hadith version? How is it that the 4 religions could hold the exact same view, inspired by the exact same source text, and be treated so differently? especially when the only one given a pass is also the one most guilty. There are Christian countries where homosexuality is still illegal, but the 5 that give the death penalty for it are Islamic. That isn't to excuse the Christian countries, and nobody is, but the form of Christianity practiced in those countries is contained. They are not exporting it in the form of mass migration that isn't expected to adapt to its new culture, and is shielded from criticism when it doesn't, or in the form of propaganda spread throughout the world by fundamentalists. Nor is Christianity treated with the same kid gloves that Islam is. Buzzfeed is not openly defending Leviticus as something that everyone should be tolerant of. Now Christians, don't go taking these quotes from the Hadith as an excuse to hate on all Muslims. I see quotes from the Quran come up often from the right as a way to paint all Muslims as horrible people. But you don't get to hold all Muslims accountable for what the Hadith or the Quran says unless you want to be held accountable for what Leviticus or much of the Old Testament says. Especially those of you who quote the Old Testament to support your political views. We cannot give Buzzfeed the same pass that we give the Christian right or the moderate Muslims though, because they specifically said that you should be okay with someone embracing all of the doctrines of Islam, which by definition would include the ones that lead Muslims in Saudi Arabia and other countries to kill gay people. Now that we have the left's definition of Islamophobia, I want to talk about the way that people like Bill Maher, Sam Harris, and Dave Rubin get called Islamophobes. By that definition of Islamophobia, one would be a Christianophobe for speaking out against the Westboro Baptist Church. The definition simply doesn't hold water unless you have a binary on-off brain that cannot distinguish the nuance between talking about certain members of a religion who hold a certain interpretation of that religion and talking about all members of that religion. This projecting the views that someone holds about a specific person or set of ideas onto all people who share a physical characteristic or identity with that person is the left's primary tool for labeling everyone who disagrees with them a bigot. Thankfully, many people are beginning to see through it. Just like opposing the Westboro Baptist Church doesn't mean you hate all Christians, opposing people that embrace Sharia law and the killing or punishment of gay people, rape victims, or apostates does not mean that you hate all Muslims. This should not need to be explained to anyone, yet it is an argument that the left relies on heavily for pretty much any topic. In order to determine if a bigotry exists, we can look at how consistently one applies their principles. The men I mentioned oppose killing gay people just because the Quran tells you to. They also oppose teaching creationism in schools just because the Bible says it is true. They attack Islam and Christianity equally. They are consistent in their treatment of religion. The left will complain that they say Islam is worse. Well, in modern times, it is. Christianity has went through a reformation that Islam has yet to experience. The Westboro Baptist Church holds signs that say God hates fags, while some countries with Sharia-inspired laws kill gay people. The Westboro Baptist Church holds a minority opinion that is derided even by evangelicals, whereas Sharia law has widespread support in Islamic countries. As I stated earlier, where such a fundamentalist view of Christianity is still practiced, it is not being exported. It represents a minority of Christian nations, compared to Islam, where many countries have strong support for Sharia law. There is no lack of objectivity in stating that one is a greater threat to liberal values than the other. If these men were really Islamophobes, then they wouldn't be standing with countless practicing Muslims who are speaking out against Islamic fundamentalism and pushing for reformation of Islam or for secular values. They would be condemning all Muslims the way that the Christian right in America has a tendency to do. The secularists do not have a beef with all Muslims, they have a beef with the fundamentalists. In fact, it seems to be the regressives themselves who have a problem with moderate Muslims, at least those who speak out against fundamentalist Islam. As Maajid Nawaz, co-author of a book with Harris, and the one who coined the term regressive, points out in his article, "Don't Call Me Porch Monkey." I'm sure any black person, trans person, gay person, or woman who goes against the regressive narrative can relate to that title, because as soon as anyone whose identity the left thinks they own disagree with them, it's always their identity that gets attacked and not their ideas. And this from those who would have us believe that they have the monopoly on anti-bigotry. I've included a link to Maajid's article in the description and encourage everyone to read it. We've already seen how inconsistently the so-called regressive left apply their principles to religion. When someone calls the Westboro Baptist Church assholes for treating gays so poorly, regressives will gladly agree. They'll even vilify the entire South as backwards Christians who hate women and gay people. But when someone says the same thing about cultures with broad support for Sharia law, that person gets called an Islamophobe or a racist. The left are the ones not applying their principles consistently, not the atheists that they are so quick to label bigots. So, is it that the left are Christianophobes, or that they have a soft spot for Islam. The clue is in the second accusation I mentioned. Racist. Islam isn't a race, it's a religion, but it is practiced predominantly by people with brown skin, particularly in the Middle East where much of the criticism is directed. Again, one needs a binary brain to think that criticism of people with brown skin that hold specific views about a specific religion equals blanket condemnation of all people with brown skin. Especially when many of the people men like Harris praise for speaking out against the fundamentalists also have brown skin. But it does highlight why regressives defend Islam yet happily call out the bullshit of Christians. The term regressive was coined because of the left's tendency to excuse bad behavior of minorities or other marginalized people for fear of seeming bigoted. But defending the bad actors of Islam just because they have brown skin is still racist. It's benevolent racism, the soft bigotry of low expectations, but racism nonetheless. That isn't the whole story though. You see, the gay people being killed under Islamic law, the women being imprisoned for the crime of getting raped, people that the secularists are trying to make life better for, they have brown skin too. Which is unfortunate for them, because if everyone involved were white, then people pushing for secular values wouldn't be getting so much pushback from the Western world's leftists. That racism, that's not so benevolent. In fact, I struggle to find a more malicious form of racism, pervasive in the Western world, than that perpetuated on innocent Muslims or non-Muslims who were killed in the name of religion, while regressives try to shut down any conversation speaking out against such a fundamentalist interpretation of said religion, and go out of their way to deny or downplay the fundamentalist motivations of religiously informed attacks across the globe. The damage of ignoring the issue doesn't stop in the Muslim countries though. As mentioned earlier, migrants who aren't assimilating well into their new culture also cause problems for the people in the Western world. The liberal media continually downplays the role that their culture and religious beliefs play in these problems. Instead of being told across the board that their culture is not acceptable in the Western world, they are enabled by half of the population saying that anyone who says that is a bigot. And it gets worse. Because people have legitimate concerns about the spread of radical Islam and the left does nothing but deny the problem, far-right politicians are moving out of the fringes. This is particularly evident in Europe, but also explains much of the support that Donald Trump has here in the United States. The policies these European groups would put in place would harm much more than just the Muslims in Europe. By refusing to acknowledge the problem and put forward more moderate solutions, the left is giving the far-right more power than they should have. Nothing about the left's position on this helps anything except for their own sense of self-righteousness. That is not compassion, it is not tolerance, it is selfishness, and it is time people started calling them out for it. Leftists, if you think this is misrepresenting you, then pay closer attention to what you stand in opposition to. Instead of jumping right to the moral posturing when you hear someone like Sam Harris speak, step out of your echo chamber and listen to exactly what it is they are saying. Because they are pushing for secular values, and you are fighting against them. You are now bigger defenders of religious fundamentalism than the right is. Fools on the left are in denial about the problems radical Islam is causing around the world. Jokers to the right group even the most moderate, westernized Muslims in with those causing the problems. And here I am, stuck in the middle with you. At least I hope so. If you are in the middle with me, then please like, share, subscribe, and comment below.